Speaking of Sweden, Bryan the Swede asks, and this is a very interesting question: when multiple bishops consecrate another bishop, whose apostolic succession does the bishop receive? Now,
I get the general. Well, remember when a bishop is consecrated, it's only in general. The general rule is the chief consecrator is the one who reads the actual prayer of consecration. So the other consecrators join in, but they're not. Obviously, if the chief consecrator is, like, for example, not an actual bishop, if he's whatever, he's just some kind of fraud or what have you, then
right.
there is no consecration that transpires. That's a matter of
The
canonical.
idea, yeah, the idea is basically that the other bishops provide what's known as the concord of the church. In other words, like, you'll see this a lot, especially with independent groups. They like listing off the names of the people that they're listed, and they just associate it with whatever church they claim to be part of. What it comes down to is that when you're made a bishop, you're not made a bishop for the sake of being a bishop. You're made a bishop for the sake of the church. And so without the church, and this is where we have all these independents, because you have a bunch of people who formally claim to have gotten consecration from this or that person, but they have no church. Their bishops that ordained consecrated them usually have no church. There's no Without the church, there is no bishop. It doesn't matter what kind of names, etc., that they have. You
Now
have to
remember,
actually go ahead.
the other participants or they are co-consecrators. That is, they were
Yes.
told that. But my point is that they all join together with the chief consecrator. So, I mean, I don't. I mean, I think there are documents that Orthodox churches like in Russia and 18 did compose about who
Yeah.
they did do that because you had to prove that, because obviously you just couldn't have someone just out of nowhere claiming to be a bishop. You'd have to say who consecrated you
Right.
and who
Exactly.
signed the documents. So that's often called hierarchical succession, in the sense of who ordained who. All right. Um, so I'd say basically the chief consecrator, but the other consecrators put their names in the documents. It's Saint Gregory the Great, in his letter to Saint Augustine of Canterbury, his position was sort of like the co-consecrators, or like you said, concordant witnesses. Saint Isidore of Seville, I believe, makes the comment that the reason the Church in Apostolic Canon 1 established the normative rule that you need at least two bishops to do a consecration was to prevent what he called tyranny in the Church. And what he means is that you can't have a case where one bishop just decides he's going to make another bishop on his own, because then everything just simply disintegrates. All right. Now you can always think of, well, what about the case of Saint Athanasius doing this, or someone in a time of heresy in extreme circumstances? But even those cases, you have to remember, later have to be investigated and ratified by the wider church. All right.
Yep.
Because there was a case in Greece, I think, like when in 1820 during the Greek Revolution or Independence War, in which there was a one bishop who consecrated a bishop by himself, and then the church later, because he thought basically all the bishops in Greece had been killed, and
Yeah. I think
he
he
thought
did like
in fact
three.
because remember the Turks executed the ecumenical patriarch in 1820, I think it was 1824, and there were rumors that all the bishops in the Ottoman Empire had been murdered. So, when the church later discovered this a few weeks later, the Greek bishop said, "Well, we'll accept this, all right." But then like a month later, that same bishop made another bishop by himself,
And they said
and they
no.
said no, no. And he says, "Well, this is no, we're not going to accept it the second time." Um, but I mean, you do have this strange argument that kind of got created in late 19th century Anglicanism and early 20th century Anglicanism, where um, they had to, and by the way, they had to come up with an explanation as to their own quote unquote apostolic confession, because obviously the Reformation was a hard stop for that. And even in Sweden, even though technically there, like the Swedish like Lutheran Church, you can read like some writings from I think even Gustav Orlin and a few others in 1920s, who will basically say the Swedish Lutheran Church does not believe in apostolic succession. They talk about historic succession, because remember, Lutheran ministers who came over from Norway or from Germany, they didn't have to be like reordained when they went into Sweden or something like that. there was sort of an attempt to kind of obscure this view in the 20s and 30s, because there was sort of this almost like, they had the Anglo-Catholic Party within the church, the Protestant Church of England. You did sort of have something like that in the Swedish church in the early 20th century, and they wanted to sort of push that kind of narrative. But they, generally, it wasn't that quite successful because obviously Luther and the Melanchthon, who is the one who wrote the text against the Council of Trent. I cannot quite remember, but the various Lutheran reformers, for example, obviously they didn't accept apostolic succession in the sense we're talking about. Obviously, one, you need a bishops ordained, and even Anglicanism, they didn't really accept it, because you look at figures like John Cosin, William Laud, and others who were sort of like the so-called High Church from the 1600s. They would still say like the Lutherans, Congregationalist Lutherans, and the Reformed Calvinists were quote unquote part of the church. All right, and they had valid sacraments and Eucharist and things. How does that make any sense? And obviously, you have Richard Hooker, the kind of the formative Anglican theologian, so-called of the 1590s, who basically said, "Oh, the episcopacy is of the well-being of the church, but it's not of the essence of the church," he claimed. All right, so that didn't mean you didn't have individuals, in the lower clergy that held like older views or something like that. But
so if you consider at the bottom of this the fight against authority, it's like you look at it, they don't want that succession, but they'll call it not the essence, they'll call it something else. They're really running from authority. They don't want that nexus. They don't want that connection, because they want to make excuses for maybe mistakes that their buddies did in the past.
Yep.
And so they don't know how to correct it all, but we'll just keep it the way it is because it's comfortable for us instead of trying to straighten it out.
Well, at this point, things like continental Lutheranism or the official Anglicanism, whatever you want to talk about, even even non-official versions, it's basically disintegrated, because obviously if you have the Episcopal Church or the Church of England or whatever doing women's ordination and gay marriage, people arguing about apostolic succession, they've lost the point by that time. All right, I mean, it's a little late to be talking about those things. Now, what is true is, I think that when you deal with like the Reformation as it happened in Northern Europe, the reformers had to fight. They had to fight sort of the conservative peasant mentality. That's why, for example, like it wasn't until like 1700 that the Lutheran Church in Denmark was basically able to stop people from venerating relics or going to kiss images or things like that, or stop people from praying to the saints. It was officially condemned, but it's very difficult to actually put a stop to it. That was sort of why, like in the Lutheran Reformation, like, one of the reasons it succeeded somewhat in these areas was it was far less iconoclastic than Calvinism or even Anglicanism. So Luther's Luther's view was sort of, he doesn't care about vestments. If you can have them if you want, you can have an altar and all this other stuff. His view is just let us preach the doctrine, and whatever happens, happen. We'll just control that. That's all that really matters. So you had cases in which the Lutheran authorities would take over like a province, and they would, for example, allow initially everything to be kept like the High Mass in Latin, and then they would introduce sort of like the Deutsche Mass, like Luther's version of the Mass, which you'd still have some vestments and a few other things. And Luther's idea was that, he wanted everybody not to perceive that a change had transpired, because partially he kind of liked things like crucifixes and what have you, and he was never a consistent thinker. I mean, he was a heretic, obviously, and he destroyed the doctrine of the Mass and the sacraments and the church. And he was, that was why people always said he was never as consistent as like the Calvinists, who simply just became totally iconoclastic in that period. And what have you. But there was something strange about how the way the Reformation was able to succeed in certain of these areas, like in England and in Northern Europe, was they had to make concessions, whether they wanted to or not, to like the mentality of the peasant population that were used to, the crucifix, the cross, painted churches with images. the concept of vestments, of processions, all those sort of ancient things that betokened an older hierarchical order of society. All right, that betokened something different. But of course, that all eventually simply just collapsed. Even when they made those concessions, you look at, say, like in continental Lutheranism, in the Enlightenment and by the early 1800s, had more or less completely given itself into complete infidelity in all matters. Anglicanism followed, was beginning, Colenso, for example, and followed, and none of those systems were able to put up seemingly much of a fight. And that's why, for example, you can look in there was this famous event that happened in, I think, in the 1830, where the King of Prussia had the synod of the, because what happened in 1870, 1880, 1818, like the German princes forced all the Protestants to be in what's called the Evangelical United State Churches. So like Zwinglians, Calvinists, Lutherans had to be in one body. All right, and if they didn't, then they would like lose state funding, or they get kicked out of the buildings, or they'd have to leave the country. Which is, by the way, how like Lutheran denominations partially formed in America, or what have you. And my point is that I hate to go on. I'm sorry I was going on too much about it, but you know, the whole system collapsed because there was a famous event in 1830 in which the king of Prussia had like these Protestant clergy, and the Prussian generals, the Prussian general who was in charge of the meeting, was so horrified at hearing the Protestant clergy deny the divinity of Christ, the virgin birth, you know, these basic doctrines, that he took out his sword and his pistol, and he basically chased them all out of the church. But nothing really ever changed. So like you have Adolf von Harnack, for example, the dean of continental Protestantism, who died in 1930, who did not believe in the Trinity. He did not believe in the divinity of Christ. He did not believe in the virgin birth. He didn't believe Christ performed miracles. He didn't believe in a literal resurrection. Now he said, for ecumenical reasons, you could use these terms because, you know, whatever, he was essentially lying. He was basically the German version of John Shelby Spong of the late 19th century. So you see how everything just simply disintegrated. It collapsed. It couldn't hold itself up.
Let me. Can I interject something here?
Absolutely.
When I took a course on canon law online through the Catholic University. It was just I just watched them all, but the professor there talked about kinds of law. You have, you know, black law. You have the law that's on the books today. Then you have social mores, that you know, the ancestral law that goes back to certain generations. And then you have laws that go back. This has been our tradition for centuries, you know, way back. And so you have here, to kind of summarize a lot of what you were saying, Vladika, is that the people, the common man, held to the traditional ways of the old church, okay? So then you have these revolutionaries that come in and they want to change everything, but it doesn't happen overnight. But they have to whittle away at the people and their mores, their old traditions. We have to break them. We have to give them new ideas and new ways and reform and form them into now our new way of thinking. But it takes time.
Yep.
It takes time. I mean, looking at, let's say, the history of America, I tutored a boy and I'm going through politics and various issues. The whole idea of liberty, it was one idea. There was one definition for liberty at the time of George Washington, but there's a new definition of liberty at the time of, let's say, Teddy Roosevelt, and then there's a new one at and Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Harry Truman, and then there's a new one with John F. Kennedy, and there's a new one with Joe Biden. So in other words, it's been morphing. They've been throwing off the old mores. Let's say, for example, when America was founded, there was a certain amount of Christianity, a certain amount of morality that the people had. Well, they would never have believed in abortion, okay? You know, they never would have believed in sodomy. They never would have, you know, believed in that as a society. But now that the ideas of liberty are changing, They've been fighting it and whittling away at the morality of the people and demoralizing them over a period of centuries to the point where we've come to today. So Jefferson knew it with the Declaration of Independence. He said he knew that liberty was going to have to include the Muslims and the foreign religions. He knew that, but they weren't there at that time because of the way the civilization was. The Western world was more Christian. So that, but however, they had created a system that opened up the door for those kinds of things to come in. And so this is where we're at today. You know, the Masonry allowed the development of these things to the point where they are today. And so what you're looking at is the Reformation started it, and they had to whittle away at the mores of the people to the point where, you know, they are today. So
Yes.
the attack is on the values of society as we see it today. There's a constant attack to rearrange definitions and ideas as you see it so well today. And so that's been a course of history for a long time.
Yes.
So I guess to ultimately simplify the answer, it's that insofar as the apostolic succession has been preserved through the church, etc., the primary consecrator would be considered that he'd have that apostolic succession, but it would still have to be within the church. So I think that kind of answers that question. We appreciate that, Bryan, and we're going to get to the next question.